What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another exciting episode of Green Dreamers. I'm your host, Nate, and today we are going to be tackling a hot button issue, and that is the Greyjoy problem. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware, whether you're on the forums or not, the Greyjoy has been performing very well, and it's been dominating the scene as of late. But today we're going to be taking a look at why that may be the case. We're going to look at some history and see if this is unusual for any one faction to be performing this well. I'm going to give you my own opinion on the matter, but I want everyone to take what I'm saying today with a grain of salt and just formulate your own opinion and what you think. I'd love to hear what you think about Greyjoy and if they're just totally overpowered or if the community is kind of blowing this out of proportion. But yeah, we'll just jump right into it. So I was trying to think of the best way to compare Greyjoy's current success to past success of other factions. And I turned to one of my favorite community resources, that's agot.cards. You can see that right here on the screen. And if you go to the tools section, you see that they have provided a lot of different sources on tracking the metagame as a whole. And we're going to be looking at some of those sources today. The first one I thought was interesting. There's the Stone Drum, which you can see according to this page. This analyzes the AGOT metagame by way of ranking the popularity of factions, agendas, and individual cards. Now, I don't know where the Stone Drum gets their information, but we'll take a look and see what the Stone Drum has to say about the current metagame for Game of Thrones. So it looks like this is an overview of the current metagame of the last 3 months. And we can see that Greyjoy is the most popular faction. You can see that trade routes was the most popular plot. Let's take a look at the last 2 months, kind of see where things fell. And we see that Greyjoy is still number one. You know, a lot of people may think that's not surprising because Greyjoy is very popular. We also see that Sea of Blood is the number one agenda, also not surprising because those two definitely go hand in hand. But let's take a look at the last 30 days. According to the Stone Drum, we actually see that House Martell and Targaryen are both more popular in the last 30 days than House Greyjoy. Again, I'm not sure where the Stone Drum is getting their information from, but according to this snapshot of the metagame, House Martell and House Targaryen are both outperforming in terms of popularity for House Greyjoy. We actually can see that Sea of Blood isn't even in the number one agenda, according to the Stone Drum. Now, this is just one website's opinion. If we head on back over to agot.cards, we can see some other resources such as the Annals of Castle Black. Now, this is truly a gem. If you guys haven't checked out this website, I definitely recommend it. This has like all the information, not just from the Jousting Pavilion, which I know a lot of people use to report their tournaments, but this is also FFG tournaments, which I know they don't always use the Jousting Pavilion. So if we look at this, you can kind of set the dates that you want, and I just picked the earliest date I thought would capture all of Game of Thrones 2nd edition history. And we can see that this pie chart of winners by faction is pretty evenly distributed over the years. Obviously, this is a snapshot of the entire game, not just one particular quarter like what Greyjoy is showing. But we can take a look at that as well. But if we're looking right here, we can see that each house is pretty evenly represented. Night's Watch and Baratheon are definitely on the bottom, but Greyjoy is by no means the top faction. It's up there. You know, it's tied with Tyrell and Lannister, but Targaryen definitely outranks Greyjoy in that regard. But maybe that's not the best way to look at Greyjoy's current success is by looking at their entire history. So let's kind of break down what that success looks like. But before we do that, let's hop on over to the Jousting Pavilion, and we can kind of take a look at tournaments reported here and see what Greyjoy's doing in that regard. Again, I just picked like the earliest date I thought would cover all of Game of Thrones history, and this also matches what we saw on the Annals of Castle Black. You see a very evenly distributed faction representation for tournament entries. You know, Greyjoy's at 14%, Lannister 14%. So very even. Targ is at 15, a little bit higher. This right here, you can see these are the number of tournament entries for each faction, and we can see that Greyjoy has peaked a lot higher. Well, I don't know if I'd even say a lot higher than other factions. Greyjoy right now is sitting at 27% of all tournament entries in the month of March, which it's been 5 days in March since recording this, so not a lot of data for all of March at the moment, but we can see they have hit 27%, which is a lot. Not to say that that number is incorrect, but it is only March 5th, so that is likely to change as the month progresses. But we can kind of compare that to Lannister back in 2016. I'm sure a lot of you who have been playing that long remember that Lannister used to dominate the scene, and everyone hated it. And they dominated for a long time. But back in 2016 of May, we can see that they were representing 25% of all tournaments. So Greyjoy doing this well is not unheard of in the Game of Thrones scene. It's definitely, I wouldn't say the average. You can see that most factions do not peak that high, but it is not unheard of. So what I thought we would do is we would go through kind of the history of Game of Thrones, the second edition, and see the trends and patterns of different factions spiking and falling. My theory is that Greyjoy is really popular for a few reasons, one of which being that their box just released. And we're going to take a look and see how other factions have performed after their box was released, and see if that theory holds any merit. So I thought in order to do that, we would jump back over to the Annals of Castle Black, and we're going to start at January of 2016, and we're going to kind of go in quarterly increments. Well, I guess this would not be a quarter, this would be a third, but we're going to go 4 months at a time and do little snapshots of the Game of Thrones meta. We can see at the beginning of 2016, and I chose this date because the first box, the Wolves of the North box, was released in April of 2016. You can kind of see that here at the top corner of this page, that the first Stark expansion, I guess the first expansion, was released back in April of 2016, and that's why I started there. So if we look at the first third of the year, Lannister is dominating the scene. Lannister has a total of 30%, which is crazy. I mean, that's so much. That's almost a third of the games are being won. The third of tournaments are being won by 1 out of 8 factions. So that's a huge, huge number. Now, we know that the Stark box was released in April. So let's kind of compare what happened. So we can see Stark has 8% of tournament wins. Let's see what happens after they get their box. So we're going to jump this ahead to April, and we're just going to move this out 4 months. So after the Stark box releases, boom, we can see Stark had a big jump. They jumped all the way up to 19%. Lannister's still holding strong, but I'm kind of focused right now on the jump that Stark made. We can see a definite increase. Oh, I'm so sorry, guys. I'm still sick, fighting off that cold. We can see a definite increase in Stark's win rate after their box was released. So let's move on to the next faction. We can see here, if you look at the bottom of this page, that the Lions of Casterly Rock expansion was set to come out in November. And we can kind of take a look at that. So this came out in November. We'll look at the snapshot right before the box and then right after the box. So we will look at just a few months prior. Okay, so Lannister's at 26% here. You know, they've dropped over the months. I think the Stark box really gave some answers to Lannister that people were craving. So Lannister kind of took a hit. But let's look at Lannister after their box came out. So their box came out in November. So we're going to jump this ahead to November. And we'll just move this out 4 months to kind of get a snapshot of the meta. And maybe that's 5 months, whatever. So Lannister actually dropped to 21%. And I find that kind of interesting. My theory on this is that Lannister was dominating the scene for so long that their box, while it included many good cards, was not a boost because they really couldn't be elevated any more than they already were. So over time, as the card pool expanded, different factions got different answers to the problems Lannister was throwing at them, and we can see Lannister kind of going down a little bit. So as opposed to Stark, after the Lannister box came out, Lannister's wins were decreasing, which is probably a good thing because I don't think any one faction should be holding 30% of wins. And we will take a look at the next box to come out. You can see the Watchers on the Wall expansion came out in April of 2017. So we're just going to do another little snapshot of that. We'll start here in January of 2017, and we will go to April. So this is right before the box. Let's take a look at where Night's Watch is at. Night's Watch has 11% of faction wins. And then let's take a look at where they are after the box. So we'll just move this out 4 months. And I highly recommend you guys, if you haven't been on this site, to kind of play around with it. It's totally fun. So we see Night's Watch after that box went down. They didn't go down by much, but they weren't boosted as much as, say, Stark was, where they jumped almost 10%, and Night's Watch and Lannister both fell. You can see Lannister now, actually, after the Night's Watch box, has dropped to 13%. Where they started was almost 33%, and now they're down to 13. So Lannister's definitely been moving around. But this is also a good point to add, like, over time, just the meta shifts so much. And even though it looks like one faction is on top right now, the meta's going to change. Answers are going to come out. People are going to figure out how to play against these cards. And it's just going to change. I think that's just the nature of the game. We can see here that the House of Thorns expansion for Tyrell came out in 2017, so let's get a snapshot of that. So they came out in October. So we'll set this to October 1st. This is right before, and we'll make this June. So we can see here that Tyrell was at 14% right before their box came out. This is wins by tournaments, or tournament wins by faction. And then let's see what Tyrell was doing after their box came out. We'll just set it out a few months, give it some time. So now we can see Tyrell definitely increase their win percentage. And that's understandable. Tyrell got a lot of good cards in their box. They weren't performing as well as some other factions prior to the box, like Lannister before its box came out was doing really well. Tyrell before its box came out was doing okay, but they definitely had room to improve, and I think that's why their box helped them out so much. I think the same can be said for Stark. Before Stark's box came out, they were doing okay, but they had a lot of room for growth, and that's what their box did. It allowed them to grow. So we can see Tyrell definitely took a big increase there. And Lannister dropping down to 8. It's so funny because at the start they were up to 30%. And now they're down to 8. So it's very interesting to just see this contrast. So what's next? Oh yeah, so the first restricted list came out in March of 2018. And this restricted list added some cards to it that were supposed to break up these combo decks. For those of you who don't know, these cards listed currently here on the restricted list were used in combo decks to allow for basically a one-turn win where you draw your entire deck and get 15 power in one challenge phase, which FFG attempted to correct by putting these cards on the restricted list. These cards you can see were mostly neutral, but they also had Lannister and Tyrell, so maybe that's another reason that Tyrell was performing so well. And then there was this restricted list that happened, so that would probably impact the success of Tyrell and Lannister. But after the House of Thorns expansion came out, we've got the Sands of Dorne expansion, which came out in March of 2018. So let's see what happened to House Martell after their box. Well, right before and right after. So we got, let's see, that came out in March. We'll set this. This will be right before the Martell box. And we can see Martell is at 18%. They're doing very well. So my prediction before looking at this is that their number is going to either stay the same or go down because they're performing so well already. They don't have that much room to grow. But let's see if that is correct. So then their box came out in March. We'll push this ahead a few months and see what happened to Martell. So Martell actually increased, so that kind of makes sense because they did get a lot of very good cards in their box. They got Dorn, which we know is now on the restricted list. They got just a lot of really good cards in their box. So Martell actually increased. We can see Tyrell also increased, and I think that's because although this restricted list did try to neuter the combo, it was unsuccessful in doing so. And we can see that from this second restricted list that came out. This came out in June of 2018. And we can see a whole host of new cards added to this list. Oh, we can also see some Martell cards. So Martell and Tyrell were definitely crushing the scene right now. And I think part of it is because of these combo decks. These decks where you could still draw your entire deck and win in one challenges phase, like with the Red Viper and All Men Are Fools. So FFG came out with another restricted list to try and counter these combo decks. And I think for the most part it worked. I don't think there have been any crazy combo decks since this second restricted list. But let's look at the next restricted list. This came out in October of 2018, and this added a whole host of new cards. This was Flea Bottom, Wars to Come, Breaking Ties, and also Mace and the Hightower. So my prediction would be after this restricted list, we would see a decrease in Tyrell's success. So this restricted list came out in October of 2018. So let's see what happened to Tyrell right before this restricted list. So we're going to do this just a few months before October. Oh, what happened? Yeah, so we'll set this to October 1st. So this is right before the restricted list. So we can see Tyrell is at 17%. And then Mace and Hightower were both added. Let's see what happens after that. We'll just do this. We can see Tyrell drop to 9%. I'm not saying Mace and Hightower were the end-all be-all for those decks, but it definitely hurt, right? The meta changed, cards were added, answers were given, and Tyrell is not doing as well. So now let's finally take a look at the latest expansion, the Greyjoy box, which I believe was released in December. We didn't get here in the States until January, but let's just say December because I think that's when other people got it. But we will do right before the Greyjoy box, look at how they're doing. And then we'll look right after the Greyjoy box. What happened here? All right. So this is right before the Greyjoy box. Greyjoy is at 15%. I also want to point out right here that Greyjoy has kind of consistently done well throughout the Game of Thrones life of 2nd edition. They've consistently done pretty well. They have a lot of really good cards, and they've been able to just keep up with the meta as it's changed. So Greyjoy doing pretty well. They might not have a lot of room to improve because they are doing well, but let's see what happens after their box drops in December. And we're just going to take this to today's date, which is the 5th. And we can see, wow, Greyjoy jumped a whole lot. Greyjoy almost doubled in percentage. And I think that is a lot. You know, I don't want to say that isn't a huge number because it is. Obviously, they almost doubled their win percentage in the course of, you know, one box. But it wasn't just one box. It was also another restricted list, which came out in January of 2019, adding a whole host of cards. to that list. And a lot of these important cards came from Stark, Ward, and Wyman. They came from Martell with Dorne and by proxy trade routes because Martell was running that. And they also came from Targ. Targ was definitely running his Dar and Marine, probably trade routes. While Greyjoy did get some cards on the restricted list, I know a lot of them ran trade routes. They also ran Raiders and Iron Mines. Greyjoy was not hit as severely as other houses, in my opinion. I think Greyjoy kind of came out of the restricted list a little scratched, but definitely not as bad off as like Stark. I think Stark losing Wyman and Ward is way more impactful than Greyjoy losing Raider and Iron Mines. Same can be said with Tyrell or Targaryen. Targaryen losing these two cards was way more impactful than Greyjoy losing their two cards. Alright, so now all of that information has been presented. We kind of walked through a history of what the factions look like before and after their boxes. And we can see that, yeah, it's kind of crazy how well Greyjoy is doing. But I don't think it's unheard of. I don't think that Greyjoy is so overpowered that they need to have all of their cards banned or all of their cards restricted. A lot of people are attributing Greyjoy's success to one card in particular, and that would be Drown God Fanatic. I really like this card. I think it's an amazing card. Obviously, it's very good, but I don't know if it needs to be restricted. People are also saying it should be errated to include a faction kneel, and I don't think that's necessary. I'm of the opinion that we should have as few cards on the restricted list as possible. You know, the meta will adapt to this Greyjoy problem. So at this point, I thought I would talk a little bit about some personal anecdotes. I love playing Greyjoy. You know, Greyjoy is a lot of fun. With their box that just came out, they got a lot of amazing cards. The new Euron is really good. The new Silent, I guess the only Silence is really good. The new Balon is just amazingly good. And obviously they got their plot, We Take Westeros, so Greyjoy is sitting pretty right now. And I think after this latest restricted list, a lot of other factions took a big hit. It kind of created this perfect storm to allow Greyjoy to succeed as well as it's doing. In addition to that, you've got Sea of Blood, which Greyjoy, I think, capitalizes on very well. So all of these factors combined make for a very successful Greyjoy environment. However, I will say that Greyjoy is not unbeatable. Having played Greyjoy so much, I can tell you there are certainly hard counters to it. For example, Targaryen Sea of Blood, I think, is a huge counter to Greyjoy. I think their characters are really strong. I think they have cheaper characters than Greyjoy. If they can get some stealth going, it's really hard to stop that. I also think Martell icon removal, Martell Sea of Blood using like Imprisoned or using, you know, Beguiled. I think those cards are also really, really good against Greyjoy. My point is that Greyjoy is not unstoppable, and I think if you are really struggling against Greyjoy, you should play with Greyjoy, because that's the best way to learn a deck's weaknesses, is by playing with it and figuring out what am I losing to and why am I losing to that. It can give you some insight onto how to beat Greyjoy if it's really giving you some trouble. But I didn't want this video to be too long. I didn't want to go on a huge rant about whether or not I think Greyjoy is overpowered or if it's not. I personally don't think it is. I think the meta will adapt, as we can kind of see that the meta always does adapt. The meta is constantly changing. Let's just take another quick snapshot. So this is the entire Game of Thrones as a whole. You can see all the, like, throughout history, the wins are pretty evenly distributed, and while in the last couple months Greyjoy has been dominating the scene, I am very confident that that will change, as history has proven it to be. Lannister was up to 30% at one point. We see Greyjoy's kind of there right now, but Lannister also dropped down to like 9% at one point, and we all know Lannister isn't doing the best right now, and Greyjoy might be super successful, but who knows? Another restricted list, some more cards coming out. I think that's going to change. And if you are listening to this or watching this and just feeling really discouraged about the game because you hate playing against Greyjoy and you hate playing against Sea of Blood, I would just recommend kind of giving yourself a challenge. And that challenge is, what can beat Greyjoy? What consistently can thwart Greyjoy? In my experience, Martell Icon Control, super annoying to deal with. Targaryen Sea of Blood, you match them on their military and you kind of can beat them. They have cheaper characters. If you hate Drowned God Fanatic, I mean, Martell also has some answers with, he calls it Thinking. Everyone can run Begging Brothers. I know that's not the most optimal card, but with Ward being restricted, I think Begging Brothers is a great card right now, and it's one that anyone can run. So I'm not sitting here saying that Greyjoy isn't good, but I don't think it's as much of a problem as people are saying it is. So that's all I wanted to say on the issue. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any comments about Greyjoy or about the meta, please feel free to leave those comments. If you like this video, throw me a like. If you haven't subscribed already, please do that. It means the world to me. And I will catch you next time on Green Dreamers.